is September 11th, 1967. While Americans back home were watching the news and starting to question the war in Vietnam, the 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division was about to launch one of the most brutal operations of the entire conflict. They called it Operation Wheeler, and what started as a routine search and destroy mission would turn into a months-long nightmare that would claim 3,300 North Vietnamese lives and cost 200 American soldiers everything. This is the story of Operation Wheeler, a battle fought in the unforgiving mountains northwest of Chu Lai. A battle where the North Vietnamese 2nd Division proved they could match American firepower with cunning and patience. Where the enemy executed the most devastating helicopter ambush of 1967, where paratroopers climbed mountains under fire only to abandon them days later, and where the brutal arithmetic of body counts met the harsh reality that killing the enemy didn't mean winning the war. But to understand Operation Wheeler, we need to go back a few months, because this operation didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a massive strategic shuffle that would reshape the entire American presence in I Corps. Spring 1967. General William Westmoreland had a serious problem on his hands. The North Vietnamese were massing forces near the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, that supposedly neutral buffer zone separating North and South Vietnam. Except, there was nothing neutral about it anymore. North Vietnamese artillery was hammering American positions. Places like Con Thien were getting pounded day and night. Marine units were taking casualties. Heavy casualties. And Westmoreland knew he needed to reinforce the northern provinces before the situation spiraled out of control. But here's the problem. The 1st Marine Division was already stretched thin across Quang Ngai and Quang Tin provinces. These weren't quiet, rear areas. This was some of the most hostile territory in South Vietnam. The coastal plains and river valleys were Viet Cong strongholds. The mountains to the west were North Vietnamese army territory. You couldn't just pull Marines out without leaving a massive gap in the defensive line, a gap the enemy would exploit immediately. So, Westmoreland came up with Task Force Oregon. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Create a provisional division from available Army units. Have them take over the Marines' area of operations in Quang Ngai and Quang Tin. Free up the Marines to move north and deal with the DMZ threat. Problem solved, at least on paper. On April 20th, 1967, Task Force Oregon officially activated at Chu Lai. The task force consisted of 3 separate infantry brigades: the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the 3rd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division, which would later become part of the 4th Infantry Division, and critically, for our story, the 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division. Now that 1st Brigade, they were something special. They'd been in Vietnam since July 29th, 1965, one of the first major Army units to deploy, and they'd fought all over the country. From the Central Highlands to the DMZ, from Con Tum Province to Phan Thiet, they'd earned themselves a nickname, the Nomads of Vietnam, because they never stayed in one place for long. Wherever there was trouble, the 1st Brigade got the call. The brigade consisted of 3 infantry battalions: 1st Battalion, 327 Infantry, 2nd Battalion, 327 Infantry, and critically, 2nd Battalion, 502 Infantry. These were experienced units, veterans. They'd seen combat in some of the ugliest fights of the war, places like Dak To, places where entire companies got chewed up in hours. Major General William Rawson took command of Task Force Oregon. Rawson was a sharp officer, West, Point graduate, World War II veteran. He knew his business, and he reported directly to the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, which controlled all of I Corps. But Rawson had considerable freedom in how he maneuvered his brigades. As long as he kept Chu Lai Air Base secure, he could fight his war the way he wanted. The 101st 1st Brigade was commanded by Brigadier General Salve Matheson, and Matheson's area of responsibility was massive. His headquarters was near Tam Khai, the capital of Quang Tin Province, positioned right on Highway 1, that vital north-south artery that connected Saigon to the rest of the country. Except in this area, Highway 1 was barely functional, bridges blown, mines everywhere. Viet Cong ambushes a daily occurrence. Moving supplies by road was suicide. Everything came by helicopter or not at all. From May through August 1967, Task Force Oregon conducted a series of operations with names that would become infamous. Operations: Malheur 1 and 2, Hood River, Benton, Cook. These were search and destroy missions. The goal was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with overwhelming firepower, then move to the next objective. The enemy in this area was no joke. The Viet Cong 2nd Regiment operated throughout the coastal plains and valleys. These guys knew every trail, every tunnel, every hiding spot. They'd been fighting in this terrain for years. Decades if you counted the war against the French. They could disappear into the population or melt into the jungle at will. Catching them was like trying to grab smoke. But the real threat wasn't the Viet Cong. It was the North Vietnamese Army 2nd Division. Regular army, well-trained, well-equipped, well-led. The 2nd Division had been operating in Quang Tin and Quang Nam provinces since 1966. They knew the terrain as well as the VC. But unlike guerrillas who hit and ran, the NVA would stand and fight when the conditions were right. They had the discipline and firepower to trade blows with American units, and they were learning. Every engagement taught them something new about American tactics, about how airmobile operations worked, about American weaknesses they could exploit. By September 1967, intelligence reports indicated the 2nd Division was planning something. Something big: radio intercepts, agent reports, pattern analysis. All the indicators pointed to an offensive in the making. The 2nd Division had pulled back into the mountains west of Tam Kai, into an area called the Quai Son Valley. Rugged terrain, triple canopy jungle on the slopes, rice paddies in the valley floor, perfect defensive ground. They were regrouping, resupplying, training, getting ready. And that's where Operation Wheeler comes in. September 11th, 1967. 0500 hours. First light was still an hour away when the first helicopters lifted off from Chu Lai. Huey gunships, slicks loaded with infantry, Chinooks carrying artillery and supplies. The whole air armada headed northwest toward Tam Kai, toward the mountains, toward the enemy. Operation Wheeler was launching under the command of Brigadier General Matheson and his 1st Brigade. The mission was straightforward on paper: conduct a series of battalion-sized combat assaults onto the high ground west of Tam Kai, establish fire support bases, then conduct aggressive search and destroy operations to locate and destroy enemy forces, base camps, and fortifications. Drive the 2nd Division out of the Quai Son Valley, or kill them trying. The area of operations was about 20 miles northwest of Chu Lai. The terrain was unforgiving: steep mountains rising to 3,000 feet, dense jungle, terrible fields of fire. The valleys were a mix of rice paddies, villages, and heavy vegetation. During the rainy season, which was just ending, the whole area turned into a swamp. Now in September, it was merely miserable instead of impossible. The 1st Brigade would be coordinating with Marine and ARVN units conducting Operation Swift/Lean Ket 116 in the adjacent Quai Son Valley. The idea was to catch the 2nd Division in a vice, Marines pushing from one direction, the 101st from another, classic hammer and anvil, except the enemy had a vote in how this played out. The opening moves went according to plan. 1st Battalion, 327 Infantry Combat assaulted onto a ridgeline west of Tam Kai. They immediately began improving the landing zone for follow-on forces, engineers, artillery, all the supporting elements needed to establish a fire support base. A fire base that would serve as a logistics hub and fire support platform for operations deeper into the mountains. 2nd Battalion, 327 Infantry hit another landing zone to the north. Their mission was to sweep through a network of valleys intelligence. Believed were concealing enemy base camps. They moved out in company-sized elements, squads on point. Everyone sweating in the humid heat, waiting for the first crack of an AK-47, the first explosion of a booby trap. In Vietnam, contact was never a question of if, only when. 2nd Battalion, 502, Infantry, the unit that would become central to our story, was held in reserve initially. They were staged at Chu Lai, ready to reinforce wherever contact developed, ready to exploit any opportunity that presented itself. The first day was relatively quiet. A few sniper rounds, some small arms fire that evaporated as soon as the Americans called in gunships. The enemy was watching, probing, trying to figure out what the Americans were up to, where they were going, what their vulnerabilities might be. Day 2, things heated up. 1st Battalion, 3-2. 7 ran into a company-sized enemy force in heavy jungle. The fighting was close range, vicious. You couldn't see 10 meters in. The vegetation. The North Vietnamese had prepared fighting positions, spider holes connected by communication trenches. They'd let the lead elements pass, then opened up from the flanks and rear. Classic L-shaped ambush. The battalion commander immediately called for artillery. Fire missions from Tam Kai, from Chu Lai. High explosive rounds crashing through the canopy. The problem with artillery in jungle is you can't see what you're hitting. The rounds explode in the trees. Shrapnel rains down. It's effective if you know where the enemy is, but in dense vegetation, with firefights at close range, you can end up killing your own men as easily as the enemy. The fight lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous contact. When it finally broke, the Americans counted 32 enemy bodies. Actual body count, not estimates. 32 North Vietnamese soldiers who weren't going anywhere. American casualties were lighter. 8 wounded, none killed. But everyone knew that first contact had been the enemy's choice. They'd broken contact when they wanted to. Faded back into the jungle on their terms. That became the pattern for Operation Wheeler. Battalion-sized sweeps through difficult terrain. Contact with enemy forces that seemed to melt away before overwhelming firepower could be brought to bear. Small victories measured in enemy bodies, but nothing decisive, nothing that felt like it was breaking the back of the 2nd Division. The Americans were learning what Marines already knew from their time in the Quai Son Valley. The North Vietnamese in this area weren't going to fight a stand-up battle they couldn't win. They'd pick their moments, hit where the Americans were weak, avoid strength. Classic guerrilla tactics. Except these guys weren't guerrillas. They were regular army trained in asymmetric warfare, the most dangerous kind of enemy. By late September, Operation Wheeler had settled into a rhythm, a brutal, exhausting rhythm. Each morning, companies would move, out from their night defensive positions. Each night, they'd establish new perimeters, dig in, set out claymore mines, establish listening posts, then do it all again the next day. The terrain made everything harder. Moving through the mountains wasn't like walking through a park. It was climbing, pulling yourself up slopes using tree roots and vines, machetes to cut through wait-a-minute vines that grabbed your uniform, your gear, your flesh. Each man carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment, ammunition, water, rations, radios, machine gun belts, mortar rounds, everything needed to sustain operations in the field. Water was a constant problem. You couldn't drink from streams, not unless you wanted to get dysentery or worse. So, you carried what you needed, 2 canteens, maybe 3, that's it. And in the heat and humidity of the Vietnamese mountains, you could go through your water in hours. Helicopter resupply was supposed to bring more, but helicopters couldn't always land in the jungle. They'd have to hover and kick out supplies, water bladders, ammunition crates, rations, everything tumbling through the trees, sometimes landing on the enemy side of the perimeter, sometimes lost in the jungle. Then there were the booby traps. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were masters of improvised explosive devices before that term even existed. Punji stakes smeared with feces, pressure-activated mines made from unexploded American ordnance, grenades rigged to tripwires. Entire trails could be mined. You'd advance cautiously, looking for disturbed earth, fishing lines strung between trees, anything that didn't look right. And sometimes, you'd spot them. Sometimes, you wouldn't. On September 23rd, Alpha Company of 2nd Battalion, 502, was moving through a valley when the point man triggered a mine. The explosion was massive, multiple artillery shells wired together, buried in the trail. The blast killed 3 men instantly, wounded 7 more. The company immediately halted, set up a perimeter, called for a medevac. But the landing zone was hot. The enemy had positioned the mine perfectly. As soon as the helicopters tried to land, they took small arms fire from the tree line. The company commander had a choice. Try to clear the landing zone under fire, or carry the wounded to a better pickup point. He chose to fight, called in gunships. The Huey gunships came in low and fast, miniguns screaming, rockets slamming into the wood line. The enemy fire slackened. The medevac birds came in. loaded the wounded, got out. Total time from mine, strike to dust off. 45 minutes. It felt like hours to the men on the ground. That same week, 1st Battalion, 327, discovered a major enemy base camp. Not just a few bunkers, a full complex. Underground bunkers with multiple rooms, medical facilities, ammunition storage, living quarters for a battalion-sized unit. The enemy had abandoned it recently, rice still warm and cooking, pots, documents scattered everywhere. Intelligence officers would later determine this had been a regimental headquarters. The battalion spent 2 days destroying the complex. Explosives packed into bunkers, controlled demolitions. The whole place went up in a series of thunderous blasts that could be heard for miles. Smoke rising above the jungle canopy. A clear message to the enemy. We found your base. We destroyed it. We're coming for you. But the enemy didn't seem particularly concerned. 2 days after the base camp was destroyed, 2nd Battalion, 327, walked into an ambush 3 kilometers away. The North Vietnamese had set up on a ridgeline, overlooking a trail the Americans had to use. Classic military crests position. They waited until the entire column was in the kill zone, then opened up with everything they had: small arms, machine guns, RPGs, mortars. The lead platoon took the brunt of it. Men diving for cover, returning fire at muzzle flashes. The company? Commander immediately maneuvered his other platoons to flank the enemy position. Classic fire and maneuver. One element suppresses, another moves. Except in jungle terrain, maneuvering is incredibly difficult. You can't see where you're going. You can't see where the enemy is. You navigate by sound and by faith that your map is accurate. Artillery came in. Danger close. Within 200 meters of friendly positions. The forward observer was calling adjustments based on where the rounds were impacting versus where the enemy fire was coming from. It's an art as much as a science. Get it right and you save American lives. Get it wrong and you kill your own men. The artillery did its job. The enemy fire slackened. The Americans assaulted the position, found blood trails, drag marks, equipment left behind in hasty retreat. But no bodies. The North Vietnamese had pulled their casualties out under fire. That was standard practice for them. Deny the Americans their precious body count. Don't let them know how effective their fire had been. This became frustrating for American commanders. They were under constant pressure to produce body counts. Higher headquarters wanted numbers, quantifiable measures of success. How many enemy killed? How many weapons captured? That's how they measured progress. But the enemy refused to cooperate with American metrics. They'd haul away their dead and wounded whenever possible. Leave the Americans counting blood trails and estimating casualties. By early October, the 1st Brigade had been conducting continuous operations for 3 weeks. The men were exhausted, uniforms rotted off from the humidity, boots falling apart, jungle rot on their feet and hands. They rotated companies back to rear areas when possible. A couple days to shower, eat hot food, get new uniforms. But then right back into the field. The tempo of operations never slowed. And that's when General Matheson got reinforcements. 1st Battalion, 35th. Infantry from the 4th Infantry Division joined the operation. Fresh troops. A whole battalion. That brought his combat power up significantly. Now he could keep more units in the field simultaneously. Cover more ground. Put more pressure on the 2nd Division. The 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Dorland, an aggressive officer, a West Pointer who'd seen combat before. He wanted his battalion blooded, wanted to prove they could fight as well as the 101st paratroopers, who'd been in country longer. That competitive spirit between units could be useful. It could also be dangerous if commanders took unnecessary risks to prove themselves. October 4th, 1967. Just as Operation Wheeler was settling into its grueling rhythm, another operation kicked off in the northern part of the Quai San Valley. Operation Wallowa. This one was run by the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division, the 1st Cav, the most famous airmobile unit in the Army. The 3rd Brigade was commanded by Colonel Hubert S. Campbell, and his mission was similar to Wheeler, but with a different approach. While Wheeler focused on battalion-sized combat assaults onto high ground, followed by ground sweeps, Wallowa emphasized intensive aerial surveillance, followed by quick reaction forces. The 1st Cav had more helicopters than the 101st's Brigade. They could afford to run constant aerial recon missions. scout helicopters looking for targets, attack helicopters ready to pounce. The first CAV's tactics were built around what they called pink teams. A pink team consisted of a white team and a red team working together. The white team was a scout helicopter, an OH-23 Raven or a light observation helicopter. It would fly low and slow, looking for enemy positions, looking for any sign of the North Vietnamese. When they found something, or more accurately when they drew fire, that's when the red team came. In the red team was an attack helicopter, a Huey gunship, sometimes multiple gunships. They'd roll in hot on whatever the scout had found, miniguns blazing, rockets away, suppressing the enemy position. And then came the blue team. The blue teams were aero rifle platoons, small infantry units, usually 6 men, specially trained for helicopter operations. They'd insert right on top of whatever the gunships had hit, mop up, assess the damage, capture any documents or equipment, take prisoners if possible, then extract before the enemy could organize a counterattack. When a white team and red team worked together, they called it a pink team, cute name for a lethal combination. And at first, it worked brilliantly. The North Vietnamese weren't used to this level of helicopter activity. The Marines had fewer choppers. They were more infantry-focused. So, when the first CAV showed up with their air cavalry tactics, it caught the enemy off guard. In the first week of Wallowa, pink teams killed dozens of enemy soldiers. The scout birds would spot NVA troops moving during the day, something the North Vietnamese had gotten away with when fighting Marines. But the gunships would catch them in the open. Rice paddies, trails, village areas, nowhere to hide. The miniguns on those Hueys could fire 4,000 rounds per minute, the entire 6-barrel assembly rotating, spitting out a solid stream of red tracers. Devastating. But the North Vietnamese adapted fast, really fast. Within 2 weeks, they'd developed countermeasures. They stopped moving during the day, only traveled at night or in terrible weather when helicopters couldn't fly. They positioned heavy anti-aircraft weapons along likely helicopter routes, and they studied American helicopter tactics, looking for patterns, looking for weaknesses to exploit. The heavy anti-aircraft guns were particularly concerning. The North Vietnamese had 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns, Soviet-made, similar to the American .50 caliber, but fired from a different position. These guns were designed to shoot down aircraft. They had excellent range, good penetration. A burst from a DSHK could tear apart a Huey, and the North Vietnamese were getting good at concealing them. They'd position the guns on hilltops overlooking likely landing zones, cover them with camouflage netting. Wait. When American helicopters came in, they'd let the first ones pass. Let them land. Let them start unloading troops. Then they'd open up on the follow-on birds, the ones still in the air, the most vulnerable. October also brought a change in overall command structure. On September 22nd, Brigadier General Samuel Coaster had taken command of Task Force Oregon from Major General Rawson, and on September 25th, Task Force Oregon officially became the 23rd Infantry Division, the Americal Division. The name Americal came from American New Caledonian Division, a unit that fought in World War II. Reviving that name was supposed to give the division an instant lineage, a sense of history. But the name change didn't matter to the grunts on the ground. They were still fighting the same enemy in the same mountains, still getting shot at, still dying. The only practical difference was Task Force Oregon now had 2 more infantry brigades arriving, the 198th Light Infantry Brigade and the 11th Infantry Brigade. Fresh units from the States. These would replace the brigades that had been borrowed from other divisions, including eventually the 101st's 1st Brigade. General Coaster now commanded both Wheeler and Wallowa, 2 separate operations, different brigades, different areas, but the same overall mission. Find the 2nd Division, fix them, destroy them. The problem was, the operations weren't particularly well coordinated. Wheeler did its thing. Wallowa did its thing. There was communication between brigade headquarters, sure, but on the ground. Level, units from different brigades rarely worked together. That lack of integration would have consequences. November 13th, 1967, a date that would go down in aviation history for all the wrong reasons. The day the North Vietnamese 2nd Division executed the most sophisticated helicopter ambush of the war up to that point. The day that proved the enemy had truly mastered the art of shooting down American aircraft. It started with intelligence. Coaster's staff had been tracking increased enemy activity. Radio intercepts suggested something was building, some kind of operation. Maybe an attack on Landing Zone Ross, one of the major fire support bases in the area. Or possibly LZ Baldy. Both were tempting targets, heavily fortified positions, yes, but also loaded with ammunition, fuel, and supplies. If the enemy could overrun one, it would be a major propaganda victory. Coster needed better intelligence. He needed to know where the enemy was concentrating, what they were planning, so he turned to his aerial reconnaissance teams. Those pink teams that had been so effective early in Wallowa. Send them out, find the enemy, figure out what they're up to. November 13th, mid-morning, a blue team, a 6-man reconnaissance squad, was flying in a Huey Slick, standard transport helicopter, no gunships. They were doing aerial reconnaissance over an area southeast of LZ Ross. Rice paddies, tree lines, villages scattered across the landscape. The helicopter was flying low, maybe 500 feet. The team leader was looking out the door, scanning the ground for any sign of enemy activity. Then the machine gun fire started. Not just one gun, multiple heavy machine guns. 12.7mm rounds punching through the thin aluminum skin of the Huey like it wasn't even there. The pilot tried to take evasive action, banking hard, diving. But it was too late. The helicopter was mortally wounded, smoke pouring from the engine, alarms blaring. In the cockpit, the pilot managed to put the bird down in a rice paddy, hard landing. The Huey slammed into the mud and water. The impact threw the door gunners around. The blue team got their weapons and bailed out. The pilot struggled with their harnesses, got free, scrambled out. They were taking fire immediately. Small arms, machine guns. The enemy had them zeroed in. The team leader got on the radio. Immediate request for extraction. They were pinned down in a rice paddy with minimal cover, taking casualties. They needed gunships, they needed a rescue bird, they needed it now. 3 helicopters responded, a mix of slicks and gunships. The cavalry always rode to rescue downed air crews. Always. That was the unwritten rule. You never left anyone behind. The rescue force came in hot. Gunships laying down suppressive fire. A slick heading for the stranded aircrew in the paddy. That's when the trap sprung. As many as 6 heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously from concealed positions on a nearby knoll. The North Vietnamese had positioned them perfectly, interlocking fields of fire, covering the rice paddy where the first helicopter had gone down, covering the likely approach routes for rescue birds. One of the rescue helicopters exploded in midair, just disintegrated. A DSHK round must have hit something critical. Fuel, ammunition. The Huey became a ball of flame and metal falling out of the sky. Everyone aboard killed instantly. 2 more helicopters were hit and forced to make emergency landings. Now, instead of 1 downed crew, there were multiple crews scattered across the landscape, all taking fire, all needing rescue. The Tactical Operations Center at Brigade Headquarters went into crisis mode. Multiple aircraft down, multiple casualties, enemy anti-aircraft positions engaging anything that flew nearby. This was rapidly becoming a disaster. They needed to get those men out. But sending more helicopters into that kill zone was suicide. General Matheson, commanding the 1st Brigade, made a critical decision. Ground forces, send in infantry to secure the area, clear those machine gun positions. Then helicopters could come in safely for extraction. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Dorland, commanding the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, to move his unit to the contact area immediately, secure the downed crews, destroy the anti-aircraft positions. Dorland's battalion was several kilometers away. They'd have to move fast. His companies saddled up and moved out at the double, moving through rice paddies and across dikes, exposed to enemy fire the whole way. But they had to get there. Americans were dying. While the ground forces moved, air support hammered the enemy positions. F-4 Phantom screamed in, dropping 500-pound bombs. A-4 Skyhawks from the Marines at Chu Lai added their ordnance. Napalm, cluster bombs. The whole area became an inferno. But the enemy anti-aircraft guns kept firing. They dug in. deep. Bunkers with overhead cover, camouflage. They'd prepared this position specifically to shoot down helicopters. By the time Dorland's infantry arrived, hours had passed. The battle had become a fight to silence those machine gun positions. Companies maneuvered under fire. Artillery was called in. Danger close. Forward observers adjusting fire based on where the tracers were coming from. It's a nerve-wracking business calling artillery when your own men are within the blast radius, but desperate times. Finally, by late afternoon, the anti-aircraft positions were overrun. Americans found the gun positions, 6 DSHK heavy machine guns, each one in a fortified bunker with excellent fields of fire. Ammunition stockpiled. The North Vietnamese had planned this ambush. They'd studied American rescue procedures, positioned their weapons to maximize kills. And it had worked. Final tally from November 13th. 22 Americans killed, 28 wounded, over 20 helicopters, hit by enemy fire, 8 destroyed or severely damaged beyond repair. It was the worst single day for Army aviation in the Wheeler Wallowa area of operations, and it sent shockwaves through the command structure. The Americal Division changed its doctrine immediately. No more helicopter-centric rescue operations. Ground units would spearhead future rescue efforts, secure the area first, then bring in the birds. It was a hard lesson learned in blood, but it was learned. For the men on the ground, November 13th was a stark reminder that the enemy wasn't some ignorant peasant army. The North Vietnamese 2nd Division was professional, adaptive, deadly. They'd taken American tactics, studied them, and developed effective countermeasures. And they'd do it again. November 11th, 1967. 2 days before the helicopter massacre, General Coaster made a command decision. He merged Operations Wheeler and Wallowa into a single operation, Wheeler Wallowa. The reason was practical. Having 2 separate operations in the same general area was creating coordination headaches. Units from different brigades would bump into each other. Fire support coordination was complex. Logistics were a nightmare. Better to combine them under unified command and control. So, Wheeler Wallowa it was. 7 U.S. Army infantry battalions now working the same area. Their mission remained consistent. Find and destroy enemy forces in the Quai Son and Heap Duke valleys. Provide security to Tam Kai. Keep Highway 1 open. That last one was particularly challenging. Highway 1, remember, was the vital north-south artery, the only way to move supplies by road between Chu Lai and Da Nang. But in the Wheeler Wallowa area, the road was barely functional. The enemy mined it every night, hit convoys with ambushes, blew bridges. It was a daily fight just to keep that road marginally usable. The American Division assigned engineer units to constant road clearing operations. Every morning, minesweeping teams would leave from Landing Zone Baldy and Landing Zone Ross. They'd move toward each other on Highway 535, which connected the 2 bases. Infantry provided security. The engineers would sweep for mines. When they found one, they'd carefully defuse it or blow it in place. Then the convoy could move. Except the enemy got smart about this too. They'd watch the sweep teams pass, then plant mines behind them. Or they'd position anti-tank weapons in the dense vegetation alongside the road. Wait for armored vehicles, RPG teams, recoilless rifles. Even when the convoys had their own security elements, armored cavalry and mechanized infantry, they'd still lose at least one vehicle almost every day. The narrow road with thick vegetation on both sides was perfect ambush terrain. Kill zones everywhere. The enemy would hit the convoy, destroy a vehicle, then fade back into the jungle before reaction forces could engage. Frustrating, costly. But the alternative was moving everything by helicopter, which had its own risks as November 13th proved. Meanwhile, the infantry battalions continued their search and destroy missions. Companies moving through assigned sectors, looking for enemy base camps, caches of weapons and supplies. The 2nd Division had pulled back deeper into the mountains after the intensive American operations through October. But they hadn't left the area. Intelligence knew they were still out there, watching, waiting, preparing. The brigade from the 1st Cav, Colonel Campbell's 3rd Brigade, controlled the northern part of the operational area. They established Landing Zone Baldy as their main fire base. LZ Baldy sat at the intersection of Highway 1 and Route 535. Strategic position. Good helicopter access. Artillery coverage across a wide area. The 1st Cav used their mobility advantage to run constant air assault operations. Hitting suspected enemy positions. Inserting quick reaction. Forces when contact developed. The 101st's 1st Brigade, still under Matheson, worked the southern and western portions. They'd established multiple fire support bases in the mountains. These fire bases served as logistical hubs and artillery platforms. 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns, providing fire support to infantry companies operating within range. Without that artillery umbrella, infantry units would be dangerously exposed. The 196th Infantry Brigade took over some sectors as well. And in late October, the 198th Light Infantry Brigade arrived from Fort Hood, Texas, brand new to Vietnam. They deployed to Duke Pho for in-country training. The battle-hardened soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division's 3rd Brigade gave them crash courses in jungle warfare, booby traps, ambush drills, how to call for fire support, all the things you needed to know to survive. Once the 198th was deemed ready, they began taking over security responsibilities, first at Chu Lai itself, protecting the airbase, then gradually expanding into combat operations. Fresh troops eager to prove themselves. Veterans worried the new guys would make rookie mistakes that would get people killed. That tension between FNGs, fresh new guys, and short-timers who just wanted to survive their tours was constant. By late November, 1st Brigade of the 101st was winding down its participation in Wheeler Wallowa. They'd been in continuous combat operations for months. The men needed rest. The units needed to refit. General Matheson flew his brigade down to Phan Rang Air Base in 2 Corps for a month-long mission. Different area, different enemy, but at least a break from the mountains around Tam Kai. The 196th Brigade took over the southern portion of Wheeler Wallowa. The 198th moved into the operational area as well. The war continued. New units, same mission, same enemy. November 22nd, 1967. A U.S. radio research unit, the kind that intercepted enemy communications, picked up something interesting. A transmission that appeared to come from the headquarters of the PAVN 3rd Regiment. The 3rd Regiment was part of the 2nd Division, a veteran unit, experienced, dangerous. The signal triangulation placed the transmission at Hill 63, a small granite outcrop about 7 kilometers east of Landing Zone Ross. Not a major terrain feature, just a rocky hill rising above the surrounding countryside. But if the 3rd Regiment headquarters was really there, it represented a golden opportunity. Catch them in a fixed position, bring overwhelming firepower, destroy a regiment-level command post. That would be a significant victory. General Koester immediately ordered forces to converge on Hill 63. Colonel Gelling's 198th Brigade would handle it. They had fresh troops eager for contact. This was their chance to prove they could fight. On November 23rd, the operation began. Company B from 4th Battalion, 21st Infantry landed by helicopter near the eastern side of Hill 63 around 09:15 in the morning. The plan was to seal off the hill, prevent anyone from escaping, then methodically clear it. But Major Dorland, commanding a task force from the 31st Infantry, was also moving into the area. His mechanized infantry and armored cavalry were approaching from a different direction. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, the heavy stuff. The idea was to use them to clear the hamlet at the base of Hill 63, while infantry secured the hilltop itself. When Dorland's mechanized group reached their position, a platoon of PAVN soldiers suddenly emerged from tall grass near the base of the hill. They fired at the Americans and then sprinted west toward a hedgerow-enclosed hamlet about 200 meters away. Classic tactic. Show yourself. Get the Americans to chase you. Lead them into a prepared defensive position. Troop F pursued, armored personnel carriers churning forward. That's when the recoilless rifles opened up from concealed positions in the hamlet. 75mm recoilless rifles, maybe 82mm. Big guns designed to kill armored vehicles. And they did. Rounds slammed into the APCs. One vehicle burst into flames. Another was mobility killed. Dorland himself was in one of the lead vehicles. The impact threw him from the APC. Then the damaged carrier ran over him, crushed him. His injuries were severe, internal damage, broken bones. But he refused medical evacuation, refused painkillers strong enough to impair his judgment. He was staying in the fight. While Dorland's armored vehicles fought back with machine guns and cannon fire, his 2 infantry companies fought their way up Hill 63. It was slow work. The PAVN had prepared the position well. Bunkers, spider holes, interconnected trenches. Every time the Americans thought they'd cleared a position, fire would erupt from somewhere else. The North Vietnamese were defending in depth. Artillery was called in, walking fire up the hillside ahead of the advancing infantry. Then tactical air support. F-4 Phantoms dropping bombs, danger close to American positions. The whole hill was being systematically pulverized. But the PAVN held on. In the first 2 hours of fighting, the Americans took 50 casualties, 50 men killed or wounded. That's the equivalent of an entire infantry company out of action. The fighting was brutal, close range. The kind where you're throwing grenades into bunkers and clearing rooms with rifle fire. Back at the hamlet, the armored vehicles were slowly gaining the upper hand. Supported by M48 Patton tanks that had moved up, they began destroying pole and bunkers at close range. The tanks would drive right up to a bunker, put the main gun against the firing port. Boom, 105 millimeter. High explosive round at point-blank range, or they'd just crush the bunker under the tank's weight. 52 tons of armor rolling over fortifications reduced them to rubble. By noon, Companies B and D from the 4th Battalion, 31st Infantry finally reached the summit of Hill 63. They'd cleared the last defenders. The hilltop was secured. American flag went up. Dorland ordered both companies to march west and join the fight in the hamlet. They'd hit the enemy from behind while the armored vehicles pressed from the front. Classic envelopment. 90 minutes later, helicopters brought in Company C from Dorland's battalion, more infantry into the fight. The noose was tightening. The North Vietnamese in the hamlet were trapped, heavy firepower to their front, infantry to their rear, artillery and air support raining down. They'd have to either surrender or fight to the death. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dorland finally relented and flew out by helicopter for medical treatment. His injuries required immediate attention. His second-in-command took over. But the battle plan was set. Keep pressing. Don't let the enemy disengage. Kill them all. The North Vietnamese chose to fight their way out. Throughout the night of November 23rd, they attempted to break through the American cordon. Small groups, fire teams, individuals, trying to slip away under cover of darkness. Some made it, most didn't. American positions lit up the night with tracers. Claymore mines detonated when enemy soldiers tripped the wires. Illumination rounds from mortars turned night into day. The next morning, November 24th, additional forces moved in. Company D from 3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry. Company B from 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry. More searchers to comb the area around Hill 63 for other enemy elements, to find the survivors and eliminate them. By late afternoon, the North Vietnamese abandoned the hamlet. They scattered, to the east and south in small, fast-moving teams, making themselves difficult targets, complicating pursuit. Classic break contact drill. Don't bunch up. Don't give the Americans a target for their firepower. Get out fast. American patrols swept through the hamlet and the surrounding area. They counted bodies, captured documents, searched bunkers and spider holes. The final tally, 128 confirmed enemy killed. Documents found on dead soldiers identified them as members of 2nd Battalion, 3rd Regiment. So, intelligence had been right. This was a regimental-level element, American casualties, 7 killed in action, all in the first 2 hours of the fight on November 23rd. 84 wounded, some seriously enough to require evacuation to hospitals in Japan or the States, but a much better kill ratio than many engagements. The combination of armor, infantry, artillery, and air support had worked exactly as doctrine prescribed. Major Dorland received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, the second highest award for valor, refusing to leave despite severe injuries, continuing to command under fire. That's the kind of leadership that earned medals and saved lives, because when the commander stays, the men stay. When the commander fights, the men fight. What was the 3rd Regiment doing at Hill 63? That remained unclear. The documents captured gave some insights: maps, operation orders, supply lists. But the big picture stayed murky. Were they preparing to attack LZ Ross? Were they scouting for a future offensive? Or had they just chosen poor defensive terrain? Intelligence analysts debated it for weeks. What was clear was the 2nd Division remained a potent fighting force. They could still mass battalion-sized elements. They still had heavy weapons. They were still willing to stand and fight under the right circumstances. Wheeler Wallowa hadn't broken them. It had bloodied them, certainly. Killed hundreds of their soldiers, destroyed base camps and supply caches. But broken them? No. Through November and into December, Wheeler Wallowa continued. But it was the routine operations, the daily patrols and sweeps, that defined the experience for most soldiers. Not the big battles like Hill 63 or the helicopter massacre. Just the endless humping through mountains and rice paddies, the heat, the fear, the boredom punctuated by terror. A typical day would start before dawn. Stand to. Everyone on the perimeter alert at first light, because that's when the enemy liked to attack. When it was light enough to see, but early enough that defenders might be groggy. But most mornings, nothing happened. The enemy was somewhere else. After stand to, breakfast. Sea rations heated over a heat tablet. Pound cake and peaches if you were lucky. Ham and lima beans if you weren't. Ham and mothers, the guys called them. Nobody liked ham and lima beans. They'd trade them for almost anything. Then you'd saddle up, hump your gear onto your back, check your weapon, make sure you had enough ammunition, water, grenades, whatever your squad or platoon sergeant said you needed. The company would move out in a column, one platoon on point, rest following, scouts forward looking for signs of the enemy, booby traps, ambushes, anything that didn't look right. You'd patrol through assigned sectors. Sometimes you'd find something: old bunkers, equipment caches, rice stores hidden in underground rooms, spider holes concealed under vegetation. You'd search villages, question the inhabitants through interpreters, try to determine who was VC and who was just a farmer trying to survive. That's where things got complicated, really complicated. In this area, the population had been living under Viet Cong control for years. Some villagers were active VC, some were sympathizers, some were just trying not to get killed by either side. How do you tell the difference? How do you know if the old man, claiming to be a rice farmer, isn't actually a VC tax collector? How do you know if the teenager isn't a guerrilla? American soldiers dealt with this ambiguity differently. Some tried to win hearts and minds, pass out candy to kids, help farmers fix equipment, basic civic action. Others took a harder line. Treat everyone as a potential enemy until proven otherwise. Search rough, interrogate aggressively, burn hooches that might be hiding weapons. And some, a small percentage but enough to matter, cross lines that should never be crossed. That's where we have to talk about Tiger Force and the war crimes that occurred during Wheeler Wallowa, because they're part of this story, a dark part. But ignoring them would be dishonest. Tiger Force was a long-range reconnaissance patrol platoon, part of 1st Battalion, 327 Infantry, the same battalion fighting in Wheeler, about 45 men, elite soldiers, volunteers. They had been in Vietnam since November 1965, 2 years in combat. They had earned a reputation as fierce fighters, the kind of unit that would go anywhere, do anything. But between May and November 1967, Tiger Force committed extensive war crimes, murdered civilians, hundreds of them, according to later investigations. Men, women, children, elderly, cut off ears as trophies, wore necklaces made from human ears, shot farmers in rice paddies, killed prisoners. All of it reported as enemy combatants killed in action, all of it contributing to the body count. This came out years later, 1971 to 1975. The Army's Criminal Investigation Command investigated Tiger Force. They took sworn statements from veterans, both those who participated in war crimes and those who witnessed them. The statements described a unit that had lost all moral bearings, that had gone from elite soldiers to war criminals. The pressure for body counts contributed to this. Colonel Gerald Morse, commanding officer of the 327 Infantry, reportedly ordered his troops to rack up a body count of 327 during Operation Wheeler, match the battalion's numerical designation, 327 kills for the 327 infantry. Cute, except it encouraged soldiers to kill anyone and count them as enemy. Tiger Force's Sam Ibarra was congratulated in Stars and Stripes for the 1,000th kill of Operation Wheeler, a big round number, celebrated. Except how many of those kills were actually enemy soldiers? How many were civilians murdered and reported as VC? The investigation found extensive evidence of systematic war crimes. Why did this happen? Multiple factors. The stress of prolonged combat, the difficulty of distinguishing combatants from non-combatants, the pressure for body counts from higher command, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, leadership that either participated in or tolerated atrocities, a command climate that valued numbers over ethics. Most American soldiers in Vietnam didn't commit war crimes. Most tried to fight honorably under impossible circumstances, but Tiger Force showed what could happen when the guardrails came off, when soldiers stopped seeing the enemy as human, when leadership failed to maintain discipline, when the metrics of success encouraged murder. The Army investigation found overwhelming evidence of war crimes, but they didn't prosecute anyone. Not a single soldier or officer faced court-martial for the Tiger Force atrocities. The investigation was quietly buried. The unit received a Presidential Unit Citation. The war crimes remained hidden for decades. It wasn't until 2003 that the story became public. Reporters Michael Salla and Mitch Weiss investigated based on leaked documents. They interviewed dozens of Tiger Force veterans, traveled to Vietnam and found witnesses, published their findings in the Toledo Blade, won a Pulitzer Prize, and forced America to confront an ugly chapter of the war. This is important context for Operation Wheeler, because Wheeler wasn't just a military operation. It was also a moral crucible where some Americans failed catastrophically, where the pressure to produce results led to atrocities, where the fog of war became an excuse for murder. Not everyone, not most, but enough that it stained the entire operation. December 1967. Wheeler Wallowa had been running for 3 months. The Americans had killed thousands of enemy soldiers, 3,300 according to official body counts, destroyed dozens of base camps, captured tons of supplies, cleared large areas of enemy presence. By the metrics command used to measure success, the operation was succeeding. But was it really? The 2nd Division was still operational, still capable of launching attacks, still controlled large portions of the operational area. Yes, they'd been pushed deeper into the mountains. Yes, they'd taken heavy casualties, but they hadn't been destroyed. They hadn't been driven from the region. They'd adapted, learned, evolved their tactics to counter American strengths. And here's the fundamental problem with operations like Wheeler Wallowa. The Americans weren't fighting to take and hold ground. Not really. They'd assault a mountain, clear it of enemy, establish a fire base. Then a week later, they'd abandon it and move to the next objective. The North Vietnamese would simply move back in after the Americans left, reoccupy the same areas, rebuild the same base camps, resume the same activities. It was the strategic equivalent of shoveling water. You could move a lot of water with enough effort. You could even measure how much water you'd moved. But at the end of the day, the water level hadn't changed. You were just exhausted and the water was still there. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition. Kill enough enemy soldiers and eventually they'll give up. That was the theory. But it assumed the enemy had a breaking point that American firepower could reach before American public support collapsed. And it assumed the enemy couldn't replace casualties faster than you could inflict them. Both assumptions proved false. North Vietnam was pouring troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, replacements for casualties, new units, fresh soldiers. The trail network through Laos and Cambodia was essentially immune to ground interdiction. The Americans could bomb it, drop sensors to detect traffic, conduct airstrikes. But troops and supplies kept flowing south, always. And back home, public support was cracking. The October 1967 March on the Pentagon, anti-war protests on college campuses, Walter Cronkite questioning whether the war was winnable, Senator Robert Kennedy talking about a negotiated settlement. The American people were losing faith in the war. They were seeing body counts and casualty figures and asking, what are we achieving? What's the point? The military had no good answer to that question. They could show maps with shaded areas of enemy activity, They could produce statistics showing more enemy killed than American casualties. They could talk about progress and momentum, but they couldn't explain how killing 3,000 enemy soldiers in the Quai Son Valley brought America any closer to victory. Because it didn't. Not really. The North Vietnamese strategy was fundamentally different. They weren't trying to defeat American forces in battle. They knew they couldn't. American firepower was too overwhelming. Instead, they were trying to outlast American political will, fight long enough, inflict enough casualties, make the war expensive enough in blood and treasure that eventually America would leave, and then they'd win by default. Operations like Wheeler Wallowa played right into that strategy. The Americans would achieve tactical victories, win the firefights, control the battlefield. But to what end? The North Vietnamese would still be there tomorrow, still fighting, still convinced they'd win eventually, and they were willing to take horrific casualties to reach that goal. 3,300 enemy killed. How many of those were actually combat troops? How many were VC local forces? How many were civilians counted as enemy? The body count system incentivized inflating numbers, rewarded commanders who produced high kill ratios, made promotion and medals dependent on the quantifiable metric of dead bodies. That's a recipe for distortion at best, atrocity at worst. 200 American dead, 200 families receiving telegrams, 200 flag-draped coffins, 200 empty seats at dinner tables. That's the human cost. And for what? To clear an area the enemy would reoccupy? To secure a road that would be mined again tomorrow? To establish fire bases that would be abandoned next month? That's the tragedy of operations like Wheeler Wallowa, brave men fighting hard, doing their duty, following orders, achieving tactical successes, but in service of a strategy that couldn't work, because the strategy assumed the enemy cared about body counts as much as Americans did, assumed they had a breaking point, assumed attrition would lead to victory. All wrong. January 1968. Operation Wheeler Wallowa was still ongoing, though in reduced intensity. The massive combat operations of September through November had tapered off. Now, it was mostly security operations, keeping Highway 1 open, protecting the fire bases, reacting to enemy contacts when they occurred. The 2nd Division had pulled back to refit and train, but they hadn't left. Then came February 1st, 1968, the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched simultaneous attacks across South Vietnam. Every major city, provincial capitals, district headquarters, even the American embassy in Saigon. It was the largest offensive of the entire war, and it caught the Americans and South Vietnamese by surprise. In the Wheeler Wallowa area, the 2nd Division participated in Tet. They hit landing zones Ross and Baldy, not with the full force of their division, but with battalion-sized elements, rocket attacks, mortar bombardments, ground probes testing the perimeters. The Americans had been expecting something. Intelligence had picked up indicators, but the scope and scale of Tet exceeded all predictions. The fire bases held. The Americans had too much firepower concentrated in those positions. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, clear fields of fire. The North Vietnamese took heavy casualties in their attacks, but they'd achieved their strategic objective anyway. They'd proven they could strike anywhere, anytime, that nowhere was safe, that the war wasn't being won despite what Westmoreland and the administration claimed. Tet broke the back of American public support for the war. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, went on CBS News and declared the war unwinnable. President Johnson's approval ratings collapsed. The administration's credibility was shattered. Within months, Johnson would announce he wouldn't seek re-election. From a military standpoint, Tet was an American tactical victory. The offensive was repulsed. The enemy took catastrophic casualties. The Viet Cong infrastructure in many areas was decimated. But strategically, Tet was a turning point. It convinced the American people the war couldn't be won, that all the sacrifice had been for nothing, that it was time to find a way out. Operation Wheeler Wallowa officially concluded in November 1968, 14 months after it began. The American Division had rotated multiple brigades through the operational area. The enemy had been fought to a standstill in some areas, but not defeated, not broken, still there. the casualty figures tell part of the story. 3,300 enemy killed by American body counts. How accurate were those? Numbers? Impossible to say. The incentive structure guaranteed inflation. But even accepting the numbers at face value, it didn't change the strategic equation. The North Vietnamese replaced those casualties, kept fighting, stayed committed to eventual victory. 200 Americans killed, thousands more wounded, some with injuries that would affect them the rest of their lives, lost limbs, traumatic brain injuries, psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood in 1968. Those men came home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war, didn't want to acknowledge what they'd been through, didn't want to deal with damaged veterans. The veterans of Wheeler Wallowa carried those experiences with them. Some processed it, found ways to integrate the trauma, built meaningful lives. Others struggled. Addiction, homelessness, suicide. The war didn't end when they came home, it followed them. So, what did Operation Wheeler teach the American military? What lessons were learned from those months of brutal mountain warfare? The answers are complex and in some ways contradictory. Tactically, Wheeler demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of airmobile operations. Helicopters gave the Americans unprecedented mobility, the ability to mass forces rapidly, to reinforce units in contact, to resupply positions that couldn't be reached by road. That was revolutionary. No army in history had that capability before Vietnam. But helicopters were vulnerable. The North Vietnamese quickly developed effective countermeasures, anti-aircraft weapons, ambushes designed to shoot down rescue helicopters, tactics that exploited the predictability of American aerial operations. By November, the 2nd Division could execute sophisticated helicopter ambushes that killed dozens of Americans. That was a hard lesson. The over-reliance on body counts as a metric of success created perverse incentives. Units felt pressure to produce high numbers. That led to inflated reporting at best, war crimes at worst. Tiger Force was an extreme example, but the systemic problem went deeper. When you reward commanders for body counts, you get body counts. Whether they mean anything strategically is secondary. Search and destroy operations proved ineffective as a strategy. You could clear an area, kill everyone you found there, destroy all the infrastructure. But unless you stayed to hold that ground, the enemy would simply return. The Americans didn't have enough troops to hold everything they cleared, so they'd clear an area, move on to the next objective, and watch the enemy reoccupy what had just been cleared. Sisyphean, frustrating, ultimately futile. The difficulty of distinguishing combatants from non-combatants in a guerrilla war remained unsolved. Standard operating procedures tried to address this. Rules of engagement, escalation of force, strict criteria for firing on civilians. But in the heat of combat, with lives on the line, those rules often went out the window. Better to shoot first and sort out who was VC later. That mindset led to atrocities. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough. The inability of firepower alone to achieve strategic objectives became clear. The Americans could bring overwhelming firepower to bear: artillery, tactical air support, naval gunfire from offshore, B-52, arc-light strikes. The explosive tonnage dropped on Vietnam exceeded all of World War II, and yet the enemy kept fighting. Firepower could win battles. It couldn't win the war. The importance of political will as the center of gravity in counterinsurgency became apparent. The North Vietnamese understood this from the beginning. They knew they couldn't defeat American forces militarily. So they targeted American political will instead. Inflict casualties, make the war expensive, drag it out long enough that the American public would demand withdrawal. That strategy worked. Operations like Wheeler Wallowa, despite tactical successes, contributed to eroding public support. Every American casualty, every story about the grinding, endless nature of the war, every report that raised questions about what was being achieved, it all added up to a loss of faith in the mission. The legacy of Wheeler Wallowa is mixed. For the soldiers who fought there, it was a defining experience. Many demonstrated courage, leadership, and sacrifice. They did their duty under incredibly difficult circumstances. They fought hard, bled, died. Their service deserves recognition and respect. But the operation also exposed systemic problems with how America fought the war. strategy disconnected from achievable political objectives, metrics that measured activity rather than progress, tactics that won battles but not the war, a command climate that in some cases tolerated or encouraged war crimes. All of these issues would continue throughout the American involvement in Vietnam. Let's talk about the individual soldiers for a moment, because behind all these statistics and tactical discussions were real people, young men, most of them, 19, 20, 21 years old, pulled out of their lives, sent to the other side of the world to fight in a war most of them didn't fully understand. They came from all over America, small towns and big cities, farms and suburbs. Some were drafted, some enlisted, some were volunteers who wanted to serve, some were trying to avoid worse options at home. They came from every background, every race, every economic class. Though the statistics show poor and minority soldiers were disproportionately represented in combat units, the draft had loopholes and deferments that favored those with money and connections. These men were trained, equipped, and sent to Vietnam. Basic training, advanced individual training, unit training. They learned to shoot, to move tactically, to work as a team. But no training can fully prepare someone for combat, for the moment when someone is trying to kill you, when your friend dies screaming next to you, when you have to make split-second life and death decisions. That's learned on the job, if you survive long enough to learn. In the 1st Brigade during Wheeler, you had men like PFC Michael Mendoza. He was photographed during Operation Cook, firing his M16 while his unit moved to secure a landing zone. That photo became iconic. Young soldier, helmet graffiti reading, "Going home, California," brass casings ejecting from his rifle. Mendoza represents thousands of soldiers who fought in Wheeler, did their job, survived, went home, tried to move on with their lives. You had the helicopter crews, door gunners like the ones killed in the November 13th ambush. They flew multiple missions every day, exposed to ground fire constantly. No armor on those Hueys, just thin aluminum skin, sitting in an open door with a machine gun, watching for muzzle, flashes, returning fire, knowing that one lucky shot from below could end your life instantly. But they flew anyway, because that's what they did, because soldiers on the ground needed them. You had the artillery crews, the guys manning the 105 and 155 howitzers on the fire bases. Fewer cameras pointed at them, less glory, but critical to the mission. Every time an infantry unit called for fire support, it was those artillery crews who responded, loading rounds, setting fuses, adjusting elevation and deflection, sending high explosive shells downrange, sometimes all day, sometimes all night, sometimes for days at a time during major operations. Back-breaking work, ear-shattering noise, critical support that saved countless lives. You had the medics, the guys who ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. When someone got hit, the medic would be there, crawling through fire, patching wounds, starting IVs, keeping men alive until a medevac bird could get them out. Medics had one of the highest casualty rates of any MOS, military occupational specialty, because they had to expose themselves to treat casualties. But they did it, again and again, because soldiers were dying and needed help. You had squad leaders and platoon sergeants, usually junior NCOs, sergeants and staff sergeants. These were the guys who actually led at the ground level. Officers gave orders, NCOs made things happen. They kept their men alive, taught the new guys, made tactical decisions in the moment, held the line when things went bad. Many of them were on their 2nd or 3rd tour, volunteering to come back because they felt responsible for the next generation of soldiers. And you had the officers, lieutenants fresh from Officer Candidate School or ROTC or West Point, commanding platoons, learning on the job. Some were good, natural leaders who earned their men's respect. Some were incompetent, got people killed through poor decisions. A few were malicious, focused on their careers rather than their men's welfare. But most tried to do right, tried to accomplish the mission while bringing as many men home as possible. That balance was the central challenge of combat leadership. Private first class, specialist, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, different ranks, different responsibilities, but all of them human, all of them vulnerable, all of them trying to survive one more day in an environment designed to kill them. When someone died, the impact rippled outward. First, the immediate squad or platoon. They'd lost a buddy, someone they'd trained with, shared foxholes with, depended on. That loss was personal and immediate. Then the company. Word would spread. Another name added to the list. Another empty spot in the formation. Then, eventually back home. The telegram, the funeral, a family destroyed, friends who'd never see that person again. A hole in a community that would never quite fill. Multiply that by 200 for just the Americans killed. In Wheeler Wallowa, each one a universe of grief. And that doesn't count the wounded. The ones who survived but were forever changed. Lost legs, lost arms, lost eyes, burns, shrapnel wounds. Traumatic brain injuries from being too close to explosions. The visible wounds were just the beginning. Then there were the psychological wounds. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In Vietnam era, it was often dismissed as being weak, not having the right stuff. Mental health treatment was stigmatized. Soldiers were expected to tough it out, deal with it, be men. That attitude led to decades of suffering, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, anger, depression, substance abuse as self-medication, broken relationships, suicides years or decades after the war ended. The human cost of Wheeler Wallowa extends far beyond the official casualty figures. It includes all the ways the operation damaged those who participated, damaged their families, damaged their communities. War has ripple effects that extend through generations. Children who grew up with damaged fathers, who learned dysfunction as normal, who struggled with their own issues as a result. That's the hidden cost that never shows up in after-action reports. So, what does Operation Wheeler mean in the broader context of the Vietnam War? What should we take away from this story? First, Wheeler exemplifies the central contradiction of American strategy in Vietnam. The U.S. military could win virtually every tactical engagement, could kill enemy soldiers by the thousands, could clear territory of enemy presence. But those tactical victories didn't translate to strategic success. Because the enemy's strategy wasn't based on winning battles, it was based on outlasting American political will. As long as they kept fighting, kept taking casualties, kept demonstrating that victory wasn't coming anytime soon, they were winning strategically, even while losing tactically. Operations like Wheeler accelerated the loss of American public support. Every casualty report, every story about the grinding nature of the war, every month that went by without clear progress toward victory, it all eroded faith in the mission. By late 1967, even before Tet, significant portions of the American public were questioning whether the war was worth the cost. Wheeler contributed to that shift. Second, Wheeler demonstrates the challenges of counterinsurgency when you don't understand or address the political dimensions of the conflict. The Americans treated Vietnam primarily as a military problem. Kill enough enemy soldiers, and you win. That's conventional warfare thinking applied to an unconventional war. It didn't work. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt, ineffective, and lacked popular legitimacy in much of the country. No amount of American military success could fix that fundamental political problem. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese offered a compelling, alternative narrative: national liberation, unification, independence from foreign interference. Right or wrong, that narrative resonated with many Vietnamese in ways the Saigon government's message never did. Military operations could create space for political progress, but only if that political progress actually happened. Only if the South Vietnamese government used that space to build legitimacy, to address grievances, to win hearts and minds. That mostly didn't happen, so military successes proved temporary. As soon as Americans left an area, the political dynamics reverted to favoring the communists. Third, Wheeler shows the danger of using body counts as the primary metric of success. The body count system created perverse incentives throughout the military. From the tactical level, where soldiers had reasons to inflate numbers or count civilians as enemy, to the strategic level, where commanders prioritized operations that would produce high body counts, regardless of strategic value. The system assumed dead enemies equaled progress, but that was only true if the enemy couldn't replace casualties. The North Vietnamese proved they could take horrific losses and keep fighting. They had manpower reserves America couldn't match, given the political constraints of a democracy at war. They had commitment America couldn't match in a war fought for unclear objectives half a world away. Fourth, Wheeler illustrates how difficult it is to maintain moral and ethical standards in counterinsurgency warfare. The Tiger Force atrocities weren't unique to that unit or that operation. War crimes occurred throughout Vietnam. Some units, some individuals, under enormous stress, with unclear rules about who was a legitimate target, with pressure to produce results, without adequate leadership and oversight. That's when lines get crossed. Most American soldiers in Vietnam fought honorably, tried to do the right thing, showed courage and compassion even in terrible circumstances. But the system created conditions where atrocities could occur, where they could be covered up, where perpetrators faced no consequences. That's a failure of leadership and command climate that goes all the way to the top. Fifth, Wheeler reminds us that tactical innovation isn't enough if your strategy is fundamentally flawed. The Americans were tactically innovative in Vietnam. Airmobile operations, fire support coordination, combined arms integration, communications. All of it was cutting edge for the time. But innovative tactics in service of a flawed strategy just means you lose efficiently. The North Vietnamese were less innovative tactically. They used fairly conventional small unit tactics adapted for guerrilla warfare, but their strategy was sound: protracted war. Exhaust the enemy politically, win by not losing. That strategy, combined with determination and willingness to accept casualties, proved more effective than American tactical brilliance. Finally, Wheeler is a story of soldiers doing their duty under incredibly difficult circumstances. Whether you think the Vietnam War was right or wrong, justified or misguided, the soldiers who fought in Wheeler Wallowa deserve respect for their service. They went where they were ordered, fought as best they could, made sacrifices most of us can't imagine. Many died. Many more were wounded physically or psychologically. They paid the price for policy decisions made in Washington. The legacy of Operation Wheeler is ultimately a tragic one. Not because the soldiers fought poorly, they fought courageously. Not because the operation failed tactically. It achieved most of its tactical objectives. But because those tactical successes didn't matter strategically. Because the operation was part of a larger strategy that couldn't succeed. Because brave men fought and died in service of a mission that was doomed from the start. That's the real lesson of Wheeler Wallowa. That tactical excellence and individual courage aren't enough if your strategy is wrong. That you can win every battle and still lose the war. That the human cost of failed strategy is measured in destroyed lives, broken families, and national trauma that echoes through generations. Operation Wheeler, September 11th, 1967 through November 1968. 3,300 enemy killed. 200 Americans killed. Thousands more wounded. Countless Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire. And in the end, nothing fundamentally changed. The war ground on, the casualties mounted, until finally America left and North Vietnam won. Not because they were better fighters, but because they understood the war better. Because they knew that in a war of wills, determination matters more than firepower. That's the story of Operation Wheeler. Remember it, learn from it, and never forget the men who fought there.